Listen closely. I'm about to tell you something they whispered in the courts of Renaissance Florence. Something Machiavelli himself scrawled in the margins of letters he never sent. The greatest power you'll ever possess isn't in making someone love you. It's in making them realize, with a cold certainty that keeps them awake at 3 a.m., that losing you would leave a void so specific, so perfectly shaped like their particular brand of loneliness, that no one else could ever fill it. There's an old Siberian folktale about a man who fell in love with winter herself. She would visit him only when the world was frozen, bringing with her the scent of pine needles crystallized in ice, the sound of silence so complete it hummed. He spent every summer building fires, collecting wood, preparing for her return. But one year, he decided to trap her, built walls of ice around his home, thinking if he could keep winter, he could keep her forever. You know what happened? She melted, disappeared into the floorboards like a ghost made of water. The moral isn't what you think. The moral is that she returned the next winter, but this time she brought blizzards that buried his house completely. She loved him more fiercely when she knew he'd learned to let her leave. This is the architecture of modern desire. We've built cathedrals to our own neediness, and we wonder why the gods have stopped visiting. Picture this. A man sits across from a woman at dinner. The candle between them flickers. Beeswax, the expensive kind that burns too slowly and smells faintly of honey and Catholic guilt. He's memorized every possible response to every possible thing she might say. He's rehearsed his spontaneity. When she mentions her ex, he calculates the exact amount of disinterest required to seem secure, but not cold. 2 seconds of silence, a half smile, change the subject to something that makes him seem deep, but not pretentious. Nietzsche? Too much. That documentary about octopi? Perfect. He's performing availability while she's testing his limits, and neither of them realizes they're both actors in a play written by their therapists and dead fathers. But here's what the Renaissance courtiers knew, what every successful seducer from Casanova to that bartender who never texts back understands. Scarcity is the only currency that never inflates. A 24 study from the Journal of Interpersonal Dynamics found something delicious. People in relationships where one partner maintained what researchers called calibrated autonomy reported 73% higher relationship satisfaction than those in constant contact partnerships. But here's what the study didn't say, what it couldn't say without the ethics board having a collective aneurysm. The partner who maintained distance wasn't doing it strategically. They simply had a life so compelling, so utterly their own, that love became a choice rather than a refuge. You want to know the grotesque truth? Love has become our generation's opium. We mainline it through dating apps, chase it through therapy sessions that cost more than our grandparents' mortgages, inject it directly into our veins through text messages that arrive like dopamine pellets for lab rats who've learned to press the right button. We've confused intensity with intimacy, anxiety with passion, and emotional dependency with depth. There's a man I knew, let's call him Marcus, though that wasn't his name, and he might not have been entirely real, who understood this principle so thoroughly it was almost supernatural. Women would meet him and feel unsettled, not attracted exactly, not at first. He had this quality of being completely present and utterly elsewhere simultaneously, like a cat that's chosen to sit near you, but would be equally content sitting near a radiator. He never asked for phone numbers. He'd say something like, "If we're meant to continue this conversation, the universe has my address." And somehow, they always found him. The secret? Marcus had spent 3 years in solitude after his divorce, not healing, not growing, not doing any of that self-help nonsense, but simply existing without apology. He'd learned to make perfect coffee for one. He'd discovered that Sunday mornings could be complete without anyone to share them with. He'd become so comfortable with his own shadows that other people's light felt like an option, not oxygen. And that's the first paradox, carved into the limestone of every failed relationship like graffiti in a cathedral. The moment you stop needing someone to complete you is the precise moment you become worth being with. Do you feel it? That discomfort in your chest? That's your ego realizing it's been feeding on the wrong food. Here's my question for you, and I want you to sit with it like you'd sit with a loaded gun on your coffee table. When was the last time you chose someone from abundance rather than hunger? She only loves what's already dying. Have you ever noticed how funeral flowers smell sweeter than wedding bouquets? There's a biological reason for this. Lilies release more fragrance as they decay, a final, desperate seduction before the inevitable. This is also how most people love, most ardently when something is ending, most purely when it's already too late. I once knew a mortician's daughter who told me this. The living are liars, but the dead are finally honest. She had her father's hands, steady, clinical, intimate with endings, and her mother's eyes, which is to say, eyes that had learned to look through people rather than at them. She collected lovers like her father collected restoration fluid receipts, methodically, temporarily, with professional detachment. But here's the thing that would make Schopenhauer himself weep into his coffee. She wasn't cold. She was the warmest person I'd ever met. She just understood, with the clarity that comes from growing up in a house where death paid the mortgage, that everything we touch begins its journey toward absence. This is the second truth, the one they won't teach you in couples therapy or sell you in a self-help book with a sunset on the cover. We are attracted to what abandons us because abandonment is the only promise that life actually keeps. Consider the phenomenon of relationship decay theory, a term coined in a 25 behavioral psychology paper that no one wanted to publish because it made the peer reviewers uncomfortable. The researchers found that passion doesn't fade due to familiarity, as we've always believed. No, it fades because humans are biologically programmed to pursue what retreats. Our ancestors who chased fleeing prey survived. Those who were content with what stayed put starved. We're the hereditary children of hunters, and love is the ultimate prey that knows how to run. There's a Japanese phrase, mono no aware, which translates roughly to the pathos of things, or more poetically, the gentle sadness of transience. The Japanese don't just acknowledge impermanence, they make it into an art form. Cherry blossoms are beautiful precisely because they fall. The tea ceremony is profound because the exact configuration of guests, mood, weather, and moment will never occur again. They understand what we in the West desperately try to forget, that loving something is inseparable from losing it. But here's where it gets deliciously dark, where Kierkegaard meets Tinder at 2 a.m. in a wine bar that's about to close. Modern love has become a monument to our terror of endings. We ghost instead of goodbye. We breadcrumb instead of break up. We keep people on read receipts like emotional life support, technically alive but functionally finished. We've created a generation of romantic zombies, relationships that shuffle forward, neither living nor properly dead, feeding on the scraps of what they used to be. The mortician's daughter understood something else, something she told me after 3 glasses of wine that tasted like regret and dark cherries. People think they want forever, but what they really want is to be chosen again tomorrow. And tomorrow, and tomorrow. Forever is lazy. Tomorrow is intentional. She had this lover once, a sculptor who worked exclusively with ice. Can you imagine the poetry of it? A woman who prepared the dead in love with a man who carved beauty from what would inevitably melt. He'd work through the night, knowing that by morning his art would be puddles. She'd watch him work, understanding that the beauty wasn't. Despite the melting, but because of it. They lasted exactly 1 winter. When spring came, he moved to Alaska, and she let him go without a word of protest. Later, someone asked her if she missed him. She said, "How can you miss something that was perfect in its ending?" This is what we refuse to learn. The fear of loss is more binding than love itself. Think about your last relationship, the one that still visits you at 3 a.m., like a ghost that's lost its way. You don't miss them, not really. You miss the potential. You miss the story you were telling yourself about who you could be together. You're not mourning a person, you're mourning a possibility that was probably a lie anyway. The Stoics had a practice called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. They would visualize losing everything they loved, not from morbidity, but from wisdom. They understood that attachment is suffering, but more importantly, that the fear of detachment is paralysis. The mortician's daughter lived this philosophy without ever reading a word of Marcus Aurelius. She loved like someone who had already attended the funeral, which meant she could actually show up for the wedding. A 23 neurological study found that the same part of the brain that processes physical pain also processes romantic rejection. But here's what they discovered accidentally and tried not to emphasize. Subjects who had experienced multiple rejections showed decreased activity in this region over time. Not numbness, adaptation. The brain literally learns to love better by loving and losing repeatedly. We become connoisseurs of goodbye, sommeliers of sorrow. And isn't that its own twisted form of expertise? So, here's my question for you, whispered like a secret at a seance. Are you brave enough to love something knowing that its ending is already written in its beginning? Or will you spend your life clutching corpses, pretending they're still breathing? They dressed their hunger in silk and called it civilization. Shh. Come closer. I need to tell you about the wolves. In 1764, in the province of Gévaudan, France, something began hunting young women. The beast of Gévaudan, they called it. Over 3 years, it killed more than 100 people, mostly women walking alone between villages. The king sent his best hunters. The church sent prayers. The philosophers sent theories. But the killings continued. You know what finally stopped it? A local hunter named Jean Chastel, who loaded his rifle with bullets he'd had blessed by a priest and made from silver he'd stolen from a church chalice. He killed something. History isn't clear what. And the attack stopped. But here's the part they don't teach in history class. 3 months later, every young woman in the province started wearing red cloaks. Not from fashion, from wisdom. They'd learned that sometimes the wolf isn't what's hunting you, it's what's protecting you from something worse. This brings us to the third truth, the one that tastes like expensive whiskey and cheap lies. Men become wolves not from wildness, but from the exhaustion of pretending to be dogs. There's something grotesquely beautiful happening in the sexual marketplace of 25. I use that term deliberately, though it makes my skin crawl like Victorian wallpaper in a damp house. Men are checking out. Not dramatically, not with manifestos or movements, but quietly, like guests leaving a party through the kitchen door. The soft withdrawal, researchers are calling it, though they're too nervous to publish their findings without 100 disclaimers about correlation versus causation. Picture the Palace of Versailles, 1789, right before everything went to hell. The aristocrats are still dancing, still powdering their wigs with flour, while peasants starve, still playing elaborate games of seduction that require 17 different types of cutlery and the ability to compliment someone in 3 languages while insulting them in a 4th. Now picture a dating app. Same energy, different wigs. We've created a court of love where everyone's performing for an audience that's already swiped left in their minds. But the wolves, oh, the wolves are learning something magnificent in their exile. I met one last month. Let's call him Thomas, though he looked more like someone who'd been named something unfortunate like Bradley and chose to transcend it. He hadn't dated in 2 years. Not from hurt, not from some tragic backstory involving a woman named Jessica who took his dog and his dignity. He simply stopped. I realized, he told me over coffee, that he had made himself at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, that I'd been auditioning for a role in someone else's play, and I didn't even like theater. Thomas had discovered what the mystics call the paradox of desire. The moment you stop wanting something is often the moment it becomes possible to have it. He'd replaced dating apps with philosophy books, gym selfies with sunrise hikes taken alone, the endless performance of availability with the radical act of presence. Women started noticing him precisely because he'd stopped trying to be noticed. He'd become what the French call un homme fatal, not a man who destroys women, but a man who destroys women's addiction to emotional fast food. Nietzsche wrote, "The lonely one offers his hand too quickly to anyone he meets." But what happens when the lonely one learns to shake hands with his own solitude? What happens when men stop mistaking loneliness for aloneness? Stop conflating female validation with self-worth? Stop feeding the algorithm of artificial scarcity that turns every text message into a stock market transaction? Here's what the 24 data won't tell you directly, but whispers between the lines like a confession written in lemon juice, visible only when held over a flame. Male self-reported happiness is inversely correlated with dating app usage. The more they swipe, the more they shrink. But men who report 0 romantic pursuits for 6 months or longer show markers of psychological resilience typically only seen in monks and Navy SEALs. They're not giving up, they're graduating. The court of Versailles fell because everyone was so busy performing aristocracy that they forgot to notice the real aristocrats had already left for England. The modern sexual marketplace is collapsing for the same reason. The highest value players have realized the game itself is rigged, not just against them, but against everyone. The house always wins, and the house is loneliness dressed up as connection, addiction masquerading as love. There's an old Romanian proverb, the wolf changes his coat, but not his disposition. But what if that's backwards? What if the wolf's disposition never changed? What if we just finally stopped asking him to pretend to be a lapdog? Thomas told me something else, something that would make every dating coach in Los Angeles spontaneously combust. I don't want to be chosen anymore. I want to be discovered. Like a book in a library that someone pulls off the shelf, not because it was recommended or reviewed or featured on some list, but because something about its spine spoke to them in a frequency only they could hear. The wolves of Versailles weren't the aristocrats or the revolutionaries. They were the ones who left before the party ended, who understood that sometimes the most radical act isn't to flip the table, but to stop showing up for dinner. They're building something in the wilderness, not a movement, not a philosophy, but something stranger. Lives of such complete sufficiency that love becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. Here's what I want you to consider, and I want you to consider it the way you'd consider a spider in your bedroom at midnight, with a mixture of fear and fascination. What if the thing you're chasing is the very thing that's keeping you tame? What if wildness isn't about hunting, but about choosing finally and completely to stop being hunted? Where we display everything we nearly became. There's a museum in Tokyo that doesn't exist, though several people swear they've been there. The Museum of Lost Love, they call it, or rather, Shi Lian Bo Wu Guan, which translates more accurately to the Museum of Love's Failure. Visitors describe rooms filled with objects left behind by ended relationships. A coffee mug with lipstick stains that will never be washed off. A set of keys to an apartment that's been demolished. A wedding dress worn exactly 0 times. The museum's most disturbing feature? A room of mirrors where your reflection ages in real time, showing you who you would have become with each person you didn't choose. I've never been there because it doesn't exist, but I've been there every night at 3 a.m. for the past 15 years. Here's the fourth truth. Served cold like revenge that's been fermenting in the basement of your subconscious. We don't mourn who left us. We mourn who we were when we believed they'd stay. Let me tell you about the cruelest psychological experiment never officially conducted, but performed daily in every city on Earth. Take a man, any man, and show him exactly who he could have been if he'd never learned to perform masculinity like a trained seal balancing a ball on his nose for fish. Show him the books he would have read if he hadn't been studying pickup artistry, the languages he would have learned if he hadn't been memorizing text game, the instruments gathering dust while he gathered matches on dating apps, like a squirrel preparing for a winter that never ends. Schopenhauer called it the will to life, this blind, stupid, relentless drive that makes us do things that destroy us while believing we're saving ourselves. But even Schopenhauer, pessimist laureate of the human condition, couldn't have predicted this. A generation of men so exhausted by the performance of desire that they have started choosing absence over presence, silence over speech, the echo over the voice. I know a man, let's call him Vincent because he paints but not with brushes, who keeps a journal of every woman he's ever loved. Not their names, not their faces, but who he was when he loved them. Page 23. The version of me who believed vulnerability was strength circa 2015 died when she screenshot my poetry and sent it to her group chat with laughing emojis. Page 47. The man who cooked elaborate dinners for 2019 now makes sandwiches over the sink. Page 98. The one who thought therapy would make him worthy of love, 21, discovered worthiness is a con game run by people selling worthiness. This is the museum of almost in its purest form. Not what we had and lost, but who we were and killed. A 2025 study in the Journal of Existential Psychology, yes, that's a real thing, and yes, the researchers all dress in black, found that men who experienced what they termed romantic identity fracture showed brain patterns similar to soldiers with combat PTSD. But here's the kicker. The trauma wasn't from the relationships ending, it was from the cognitive dissonance of maintaining false selves. They weren't wounded by love, they were wounded by performance. Have you ever watched a method actor try to break character after playing a role for too long? There's this moment of panic in their eyes, like they're not sure which voice is really theirs. That's every man who's been playing the role of emotionally available but not too eager, successful but not threatening, progressive but still traditionally masculine, vulnerable but not weak, interested but not desperate. For so long he's forgotten he was acting. The Museum of Almost has a gift shop, because even our tragedies have been commodified. You can buy a t-shirt that says, "I survived loving someone who was only capable of loving the idea of love." You can get a coffee mug that changes color when it's hot, revealing the words, "You were right to leave," in what looks suspiciously like your ex's handwriting. But the best seller, the item that's always sold out, is a simple black notebook labeled "People I Could Have Been." Here's what Kierkegaard understood that we don't. The sickness unto death isn't despair, it's the despair of not being able to despair properly anymore. We've become so numb to our own extinction that we document it on Instagram. We take selfies at our own funerals. We live tweet our emotional collapse and call it content. But some men, the ones who've spent too much time in the Museum of Almost, are discovering something terrifying and beautiful. You can burn the museum down. Not with anger, not with some dramatic gesture that would make a good story, but with the quiet decision to stop curating your wounds, to stop being a tourist in your own abandonment, to realize that every version of you that died was supposed to die. That transformation requires death, that the phoenix isn't beautiful because it rises, but because it had the courage to burn. Vincent, the painter who doesn't paint, told me this. I stopped reading the journal, not because it hurt too much, but because I realized I was becoming addicted to my own archaeology. I was so busy digging up dead versions of myself that I forgot I could just be alive. The Museum of Almost doesn't exist in Tokyo. It exists in that pause before you send a text you've rewritten 17 times. It exists in the space between who you are and who you pretend to be. It exists in the grammar of past tense you use to describe dreams that are still technically possible. So here's my challenge, carved into your conscience like initials in a tree that's about to be cut down. Can you love who you are new, without the museum, without the story, without the evidence of all your spectacular failures at being someone else? Or will you spend forever as a curator in a museum no one else can see, polishing exhibits of who you almost were? Where silence preaches louder than any sermon. In 1882, Nietzsche declared God dead, but he forgot to mention what we'd worship instead. The notification sound of a message that never comes. The blue checkmark of red receipts like stigmata on our phone screens. The holy communion of matching on-apps where everyone swipes right on everyone except themselves. We've built 10,000 churches to loneliness and called them connections. We've written liturgies and text messages that take 40 minutes to compose and 3 seconds to regret. We genuflect before profiles, confess to strangers on Reddit, and seek absolution in the arms of people who can't even absolve themselves. But I know a chapel where no one worships anymore. It sits on a hill in southern Spain, abandoned since 1936 when the war came, and the priests discovered they believed in survival more than salvation. The locals say if you sit there at dusk, when the light dies behind the olive groves and the world holds its breath between day and night, you can hear something that sounds like singing. It's not ghosts. It's the wind through broken windows, creating harmonies that human voices never could. The chapel sings better empty than it ever did full. This is the final truth, the one that tastes like communion wine that's turned to vinegar. The highest form of love is the one you practice on yourself in absolute solitude, without witnesses, without hope of reciprocation, without even the comfort of your own approval. Let me tell you about the Hermit of Prague. Not the one from the 14th century you might find in history books, but the one living right now in a studio apartment with a view of a brick wall and a spider plant named Fernando. He discovered something in March of 23, though discovery isn't the right word. Recognition, remembering, awakening. He discovered that every love song ever written was actually about the same thing, the terror of being alone with yourself and finding the company insufficient. He'd been a serial monogamist since he was 15. 11 relationships, each one a desperate attempt to avoid the committee meeting in his head where every version of himself argued about who he really was. Sarah taught him to like wine. Jennifer taught him to pretend to like jazz. Michael, yes, Michael, taught him that sexuality was a spectrum, and he was somewhere near the middle, desperately clinging to wherever anyone else wanted him to be. Each relationship was another coat of paint over a wall that was rotting from the inside. Then came the plague years, not COVID, but the plague of infinite options that followed. Dating apps became like Amazon for humans. Why settle for the person in front of you when 17 more were a swipe away? Why work through conflict when you could just unmatch and pretend they never existed? Why learn to love someone's flaws when the algorithm promised that somewhere out there was someone flawless, or at least better at hiding it? The hermit deleted everything. Not dramatically, no farewell post, no announcement, no ritual burning of old love letters in a metal trash can while listening to Leonard Cohen. He just stopped. And in that stopping, in that divine cessation of effort, something extraordinary happened. He met himself for the first time. A 2024 neuroscience study from the University of Copenhagen found that extended solitude, real solitude, not loneliness, not isolation, but chosen aloneness, activated the same neural pathways as deep meditation and psychedelic experiences. The brain, starved of external validation, starts producing its own. You become your own source. You close the loop. You achieve what the mystics call Ouroboros consciousness, the snake eating its own tail, completely self-sufficient, needing nothing, wanting nothing, complete in your own circulation. But here's what the study didn't capture, what no study ever could: the absolute terror of that first night when you realize no one is coming to save you. Not from sadness, not from boredom, not from the 3 a.m. thoughts that sound like accusations written by everyone who ever left you. The hermit described it like withdrawal from a drug that everyone else was still taking, watching the world stumble around high on connection while he learned to walk sober. 6 months in, something broke. Not him, the need. The desperate, gnawing, existential need for someone else to confirm he existed. He started going to restaurants alone, not as a statement, but as a fact. He took both sides in conversations with himself and found them equally valid. He learned to cook elaborate meals for one, without calling it sad. He discovered that masturbation could be an act of self-love rather than self-comfort, that you could hold your own hand during scary movies, that the voice in your head could become better company than most people once you stopped trying to silence it. The Gospel of the Empty Chapel isn't about giving up on love. It's about understanding that all love, every poem, every song, every desperate 2 a.m. text, is practice for the only relationship that lasts from birth to death, the one with yourself. Everyone else is a visitor. You're the only permanent resident of your own existence. The Hermit of Prague met someone eventually. Of course he did. That's how these stories always end in movies. But here's the twist that Hollywood would never film. He didn't need her. He chose her every day. Not from emptiness, but from fullness. Not from hunger, but from abundance. Their relationship was like that empty chapel in Spain. It sang better with space in it, with room for wind and silence and the echoes of their own separate solitudes. Kierkegaard wrote that the highest form of love is to need nothing from the beloved, but even he didn't go far enough. The highest form of love is to need nothing from yourself, to exist without justification, without purpose, without even the comfort of your own meaning-making. To be like that chapel, empty, broken, singing songs that no one wrote for an audience that doesn't exist, beautiful because it doesn't need to be. So here's my final question, and I want you to answer it not to me, but to the person you become at 3 a.m. when all your masks are in the laundry. Will you have the courage to love yourself without conditions, without improvements, without hope that tomorrow you will be better? To love yourself exactly as you are, in this moment, without the story of who you were or who you might become? Will you dare to worship in the empty chapel of your own solitude and find it holy? Because if you can't, if you need someone else to make you real, to validate your existence, to confirm you're worthy of taking up space, then you're not looking for love. You're looking for a mirror, and mirrors, my friend, only show you what you already are, desperate for something to reflect. The Machiavellian secret was never about making someone fear losing you. It was about losing your fear of losing yourself. It was about becoming so complete in your own incompleteness that presence becomes a gift, not a need. It was about discovering that the empty chapel sings the truest songs,